皆さん、こんにちは。英国特許セミナーパテントターミノロジーです。このシリーズでは、特許用語、表現などをできるだけわかりやすく解説しています。講師は米国特許弁護士であるブライアン・エプスタインさんです。今回は方法クレームの基本と戦略的利用法について見ていきたいと思います。では早速ご解説いただきます。Right, Brian さん、please share your thoughts on method claims.
Sure. So let's begin by discussing why we might use method claims. The primary reason is that they can recite less physical structure. So for an apparatus claim, of course, you have to recite the apparatus itself as well as its constituent components. For example, in a computer implemented invention, we'll need to recite the processor, maybe a memory, maybe some sort of network interface. For a computer readable medium claim, we need to recite, probably a processor or an apparatus as well. And those are on pretty abstract inventions like a computer or a computer implemented invention. And therefore, on more concrete inventions involving, for example, robotics, you don't need all the physical structure of the robot. And this comes about because the machine or transformation test is no longer the clue to eligibility. All right. Long-term practitioners might remember that there was this machine or transformation test that arose from the Federal Circuit decision in Bilski. And so for a couple of months there, that's what all of the practitioners used, was this machine or transformation test. That's what the USPTO used. And then at the Supreme Court, they reversed the Federal Circuit. They said the machine or transformation test is just a clue to eligibility. And since that time, of course, we now follow the Alice v. CLS Bank case. And so method claims can be brought again. We don't have to recite a particular machine or transformation. Overall, I'd say it's maybe a little bit narrower than it was in 2007 to 2008. I don't know if that's Alice or if it's more of an evolution of just patentability. But basically, your method claims are going to be your broadest because they have less physical structure. In addition, your method claims are easily written. They can easily reflect the boxes in a flowchart. Pardon me for a second. So, for example, when you begin drafting a patent application, a common way to draft is to, first draft the claims in the flowchart. It doesn't really matter which you're drafting first, because frequently you'll work on one and then work on the other and go back and, incrementally improve both your flowchart and your claims, but they'll very much track each other. And so that's a great reason to begin your application with your method claims, right? You don't have to worry about all of the different structures that might be involved in as an example, a computer implemented invention. In addition, it can be difficult to incorporate timing into an apparatus claim. A lot of practitioners, both foreign and domestic, struggle with how to create timing relationships between different operations. So we're talking about language like if, or in response to, or based on. And that is a lot easier with a method claim where, you can just refer, the steps, the operations themselves are the elements. And so it's easier to create antecedent basis and to refer to previous steps. So, another reason to use method claims is that you can also address other issues in apparatus claims. A common one might be that your examiner might insist that the apparatus claims have some recitation that uses functional language or recite an intended use. And in a method claim, they'll recite these operations as affirmative steps, right? And so examiners are more likely to give patentable weight to these elements then, because they are elements of the claim, right? It's not just some configuration. It's not just some effect that's produced by the by some other operation of a computer, for example. Instead, these effects are part of the method. Okay, どうぞ。
はい、ここまではですね、方法クレームの利点についての解説でした。まず最初の利点として、方法クレームでは、方法を実行する装置などを限定する必要がなく、してもいいんですが、ステップを記載すれば良いということ。で、また別の利点として、フローチャートの内容を反映しやすいことと、タイミングを組み込みやすいということ。そしてさらに別の利点として、装置クレームでは、機能的表現や使用目的と判断されるような記載が、方法クレームでは、れっきとしたクレーム要素として判断されることが多いということでした。はい、では次に行きたいと思います。Okay, Brian, please go ahead.
Thank you. All right, so how do we actually use these method claims? So when we define a broad step in terms of a narrow step, we use the format of the broad portion by the narrow portion. And here, this is eloquently produced by Robert C. Faber in Faber on Mechanics of Patent Claim Drafting. And as an example, we can use communicating by transmitting. In this case, transmitting is a specific type of communicating. Another form of communicating is receiving. And so it's broad by narrow, right? So it's communicating by transmitting. Rather than saying transmitting to communicate, narrow to broad. For every rule, though, there's usually an exception. And so one of the exceptions I came up with is, except for nani to produce nani. In this case, we are using this production of an element to establish antecedent basis later in the claim. And so this isn't quite the same situation as transmitting to communicate. We're doing it for a different reason. And so that's why we'll have kind of this one exception where it's, more like narrow to broad. This is completely consistent with my experience. I had to learn this the hard way, by prosecuting real applications. But I didn't know this was the rule. This is the rule. In addition, when we're doing this, if we use the phrase like narrow to broad, transmitting to communicate, you can also run into issues with intended use or functional limitations. And of course, that's something we're trying to avoid with method claims.
はい、ここでは方法クレームの書き方について解説してもらいました。フェイバーというですね、非常に有名な本を引用して、例えば、communicating by transmitting のように、communicating という広い表現をまず記載して、その後に、by とともに、transmitting のような、狭い表現を記載するという、こういったフォーマットをお勧めするということでした。はい、では次に行きたいと思います。Next slide, please.
So when we craft dependent method claims, we have an option to limit either the method itself, such as further comprising, or some form of structure, such as further defining the apparatus, like some sort of physical structure. By physical structure, we often mean the method, the apparatus or the workpiece on which the method is performed, the apparatus that performs the method, or the workpiece on which the method is performed. We can also define other structures as well, wherein the packet comprises. And when we're doing this, when we have this kind of option as to whether we want to use, further comprising and wherein in the same dependent claim, we'll want to limit the method first, right? And so that's what this example is showing, claim 2, the method of claim 1, further comprising, nani, wherein, blah, blah, blah. And this kind of avoids an issue where an examiner might not give your wherein clause some patentable weight. If you have the further comprising later in the claim, it's a little bit risky. And again, this is an issue that even U.S. attorneys struggle with sometimes. They'll do wherein further comprising, and they shouldn't. In addition, there's a related issue where, although limiting a workpiece or an apparatus is proper in a dependent method claim, frequently applicants phrase these claims in a way that does not receive much patentable weight. So the issue is not that an applicant cannot include this type of recitation. It's that the recitation is too broad. So what do I mean? If your dependent claim just says, wherein the apparatus includes a transmitter, your examiner doesn't have to give it much patentable weight because this is a method claim. And so just adding a transmitter, adding some physical structure to, the apparatus that performs the method doesn't impact the patentability of the method. And so it's really easy for your examiner to reject it. It doesn't mean your claim is improper. It means that it's at the USPTO, it's the broadest reasonable interpretation, and that's the broad interpretation. どうぞ。
ここでは、方法クレームの従属クレームの書き方について解説してもらいました。従属クレームにおいて、方法の限定と装置の限定の両方を記載したいと、こういった場合があると思うんですけども、こういった場合は、まず方法の限定をfurther comprising のような形で記載して、でその後に where 引説などで装置の限定を記載すると、こういった順番がいいということでした。はい、では次に行きたいと思います。Brian さん、go ahead, please.
Sure. So we talked about prosecution. Let's talk briefly about enforcement. Computer implemented method claims can be difficult or impossible to enforce if portions of the method are performed outside the US. And this is just from the NTP versus RIM case from 2005. I don't know anything that's addressed this issue head on. The issue pertains to extraterritoriality. I don't know anything that's really addressed this in terms of a workaround. But what I try to do is to rewrite portions of my method claims into a wherein clause rather than an affirmative step, if it's something that I think is likely to be performed in another country, right? So maybe, some sort of data is transmitted from Canada into the United States. And, if my method claim says transmitting, maybe there's some issue where that's not actually transmitted in the United States. The transmitting is performed in Canada. If we recite it in passive voice, as wherein the data is transmitted, we might have a stronger case for enforcing this patent. I don't know. I haven't really seen anything on this issue, but it's a possibility, and certainly there's an incentive to be a little bit creative when we draft or translate our method claims. どうぞ。
はい、ここでは、コンピューターによる実行される方法のクレームについて解説してもらいました。でコンピューターによる実行される方法において、方法の一部が米国外で実行される場合、行使が困難または不可能であるという、判例が紹介されました。でこれを考慮して、米国外で実行されるステップをウェア印刷で記載するという選択肢もあるという、そういった解説でした。はい、では次に行きたいと思います。Okay, next slide, please.
Sure. So what can patent agents do? You can start application drafting with your method claims. Again, this isn't going to be for every invention, but particularly for computer implemented inventions or for similar things like telecommunications, draft your method claims first, usually in conjunction with your flowcharts. Be sure to present method claims in the United States. Remember that you get 3 independent claims for free. There's no government fees for your first 3 independent claims. That's different than in Japan. If we're talking about a case that's being foreign filed from Japan in any countries, not just the United States, but also Europe, these claims might be used to guide prosecution. Certainly, when American applicants file in Europe, where we have this sense of having 3 independent claims, a lot of times our claim sets look like, 1 through 10 are method claims, and then 11 through 15 are what Americans call dependent claims. My understanding is that they're independent in Europe, but they're basically apparatus claims that depend from the method claims, or computer readable medium claims that depend from the method claims. And so again, your method claims are kind of the centerpiece of the prosecution. And there are tips on other slides as well, like the extraterritoriality issue for method claims. どうぞ。
はい、ここまでは代理人へのアドバイスについてでした。具体的にはですね、明細書、方法クレームを書くところから始めるということ。そして、もし方法クレームが含まれていない場合は、米国では独立クレームは3つまで無料なので、追加費用がないので、方法クレームを新たに加えることが考えられるということでした。はい、では最後のスライドに行きたいと思います。
So, what can translators do? We'll want to structure method claims as broad by narrow, rather than, performing the narrow step to perform the broad step. We'll want to reorder our dependent claims to limit the method first rather than the wherein first, if the dependent claim uses both types of limitations. And if there's not already method claims in the application for some reason, which is common in Japan, where applicants have to pay by the claim, maybe suggest method claims to your clients if there aren't already those claims. You're already in there, you're already translating it, translating the apparatus claim. I think a client would be thrilled if you offered an additional method claim at, no or small extra charge, because it's an unexpected service. どうぞ。
で、最後のスライドは翻訳者へのアドバイスについてでした。具体的には先ほど述べたように、方法クレームは広い表現、倍狭い表現というフォーマットにすること。そして従属クレームでは方法を先に限定すること。そしてさらに方法クレームが含まれていない場合は、方法クレームの追加をクライアントに提案することが考えられる いうアドバイスでした。はい。今回は方法クレームの基本と戦略的利用法について解説いただきました。今回はこれで以上になります。ご質問や扱ってほしいトピックなどがありましたら、YouTube のコメント欄に書いていただくか、スライド最後に記載のメールアドレスまでお気軽にご連絡ください。では本日もありがとうございました。失礼します。
ありがとうございました。